He pointed at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. Right there, in front of everyone. This woman, Thomas Greer said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, is not what I asked for. Evelyn Hart stood on the main street of Dry Creek, her travel bag at her feet, dust still clinging to her dress, and felt every pair of eyes in that town land on her at once. She hadn't even set her bag down properly. She hadn't even caught her breath. And already, a man she'd never met in person was using her as a punchline. If you've ever walked into a room and felt like the walls themselves were against you, if you've ever been judged before you opened your mouth, then you already know exactly how Evelyn Hart felt in that moment. But what happened next? That's the part nobody saw coming. Before we go further, if stories about real strength, quiet courage, and the kind of love that doesn't ask permission speak to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Drop your city and country in the comments. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, a like goes a long way. Now let's go back to Dry Creek. The train had been late by 4 hours. That was the first thing that went wrong, though Evelyn would later think 4 hours was almost laughably small compared to everything else. She'd sat in the last car with her single bag wedged under the seat, and her hands folded in her lap like she was holding herself together from the outside in. The Missouri countryside had given way to flat, dry land that seemed to stretch on without intention, as if the earth had simply run out of ideas. She wasn't nervous, or she told herself she wasn't. 26 years old, brown hair that never quite did what she wanted in humidity, and a way of pressing her lips together when she was thinking hard that her mother used to call her planning face. She'd been wearing that face for the better part of 3 months, ever since she'd answered the first letter. It had started practically enough. Her mother had passed the previous winter, leaving Evelyn with an empty apartment, a job at a dry goods store that paid barely enough to matter, and the particular loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from having spent years caring for someone and then suddenly having no one left to care for. A neighbor had shown her the advertisement in a regional paper. Frontier towns needed women. Men who'd built something out there in the dust and heat were writing letters, looking for partners, hoping someone would come. She hadn't gone into it with stars in her eyes. That was something she wanted people to understand, though there was no one to explain it to on that train. She'd written carefully. She'd asked practical questions about the land, about expectations, about what kind of life was actually being offered. And 3 men had written back with answers that seemed, if not warm exactly, then at least honest. Thomas Greer, who ran a dry goods operation. Carter Miles, who had a small farm on the edge of town. Harold Fenn, who'd described himself as a man of modest ambition and steady habits, which she'd read 3 times trying to decide if it was reassuring or a warning. 3 letters. 3 exchanges over 3 months. 3 men who'd seemed, through paper and ink, like possibilities. She'd chosen Dry Creek because all 3 of them were there. A small town, growing slow, where everyone knew everyone, and the winters were hard but the summers could be beautiful. At least that was how Thomas Greer had described it in his second letter, which had been his best one, the one that had made her think maybe this was real. The train pulled into the station at 2:30 in the afternoon, which meant she was already supposed to have arrived at 10. She stepped off onto the platform and was immediately hit by heat that had no manners whatsoever, the kind that didn't ease up just because you'd been traveling all day. She scanned the platform. A few people moved around, but no one was looking for her. She gathered herself, picked up her bag, and walked toward the main street. Dry Creek was not what she'd imagined, though she'd tried hard not to imagine anything. It was a street, essentially. A long street with buildings on either side, some of them finished and some of them looking like they'd started strong and lost confidence halfway through. A general store. A feed supply. A building with a hand-painted sign that said "Hotel" in letters that had started peeling before the paint was even dry. A handful of people moving between these places without particular hurry. She stopped in front of the hotel and set her bag down for a moment. A woman across the street glanced at her, then glanced away. An older man on a porch didn't bother looking away at all, just stared with the open curiosity of someone who figured he'd earned the right. "Miss Hart?" She turned. A man in a decent jacket was walking toward her from down the street. Medium height, clean-shaven, with the particular expression of someone who had rehearsed something and was now reconsidering it. "Mr. Greer?" she said. "Yes?" He stopped several feet away, which was farther than felt natural. He looked at her. Not in a way that was complimentary, more in the way you look at a piece of furniture you ordered from a catalog and are already disappointed by. She waited. Whatever he was working up to, she'd let him get there himself. "You're smaller than I expected," he said finally. "I apologize for my height," she said, and she meant it to be dry, not rude, but she could see immediately it landed wrong. His jaw tightened. "I've been thinking," he said, "since I sent the last letter. My circumstances have changed somewhat." "Changed how?" He shifted his weight, looked past her shoulder like the answer might be down the street. "I've been reconsidering the whole arrangement. My sister's come to stay. Things are different now." Evelyn stood very still. "You didn't write to tell me that." "I'm telling you now." She looked at him for a moment. "I traveled 3 days to get here, Mr. Greer." "I understand that." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, at least. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Inconvenience. The word sat between them like something he'd dropped and wasn't going to pick up. She nodded once and said nothing. She'd already learned in 26 years that arguing with someone who'd already decided they were done never produced anything useful. She picked up her bag. She didn't cry. She wanted that noted, if only by herself. She did not cry. She went to find Carter Miles. Someone in the general store pointed her down a side street, and she found him outside a building he used as a sort of small office, talking with another man. He saw her coming, and something flickered across his face that she recognized immediately as the look of a person who was about to lie. "Miss Hart." He said it pleasantly enough. He had broad shoulders and a way of standing that suggested he was used to taking up space. "You made it." "I did." The other man drifted away with the practiced invisibility of someone who sensed a private conversation was about to happen and wanted no part of it. Miles looked her over. He was less subtle about it than Greer had been, which she almost respected more. At least he wasn't pretending to be looking at her face. "You've done farm work?" he asked. "Not farm work specifically," she said. "But I'm capable of learning. I said as much in my letters." "Right." He crossed his arms. "Thing is, I need someone who already knows the work. The land out here doesn't give you time to learn on the job. You fall behind in the spring, and you spend the whole year catching up." "I cared for a sick woman for 4 years," Evelyn said. "I managed a household, kept accounts, stretched money in ways most people wouldn't think possible. I can work." "It's not the same." "No," she agreed. "It's harder." He didn't like that. She could see it. Not anger exactly, more like the mild irritation of a man who expected a different kind of answer. "I think it's best we don't go forward," he said. "You're not suited for what I need." Not suited, that phrase again. She filed it away somewhere quiet and cold. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, which was at least partially true. She walked back to the main street, 2 down. Harold Fenn was where she found him, apparently, was at the far end of the main street, sitting outside what appeared to be a small barber shop. He was older than she'd pictured from his letters. Not by a little, but by a country mile. Late 50s, at minimum, with a white mustache and the slow movements of a man who'd decided a long time ago that urgency was for younger people. He saw her coming and did not get up. She introduced herself and he nodded, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Heard you were in town," he said. Word traveled fast in Dry Creek, apparently. "I have a question for you," she said, because she was tired and her feet hurt and she'd had enough of waiting for men to decide things. "Are you going to tell me your circumstances have changed, or that I'm not suited, or some other version of the same thing?" He stroked his mustache. "Well," he said slowly, "I was going to say you don't quite fit the life I'd imagined." He paused. "But you asking it that way saves me the trouble of finding better words for it." She almost laughed. She was that tired. "Good day, Mr. Fenn," she said. "Good day, miss." She was standing in the middle of the main street when Thomas Greer made it worse. She didn't know what possessed him. Maybe he'd been talking about her already, building himself up to something. Maybe he needed an audience to feel certain about a decision he wasn't quite certain about. But he came out of a building across the street with 2 other men, and he pointed at her, and his voice carried in that flat frontier air the way sound does when there's nothing to absorb it. "That's the mail-order bride," he said. "All 3 of us turned her down." He laughed. One of the men with him laughed. The other had the decency to look at his boots. People on the street heard. She felt them hear it. The way attention shifts, a slight pause, a turn of a head, the particular silence of a group of people deciding whether to look. She stood there and let it happen. She didn't run. She didn't fold. But she felt something in her chest close up like the fist, small and hard, and she thought, this is the lowest point, right here, this is it. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. She picked up her bag, she'd set it down again while she was thinking, and she walked to the hotel, and she paid for one night because that was all she could afford to think about right now. The room was plain. A bed, a window, a washstand with a cracked basin. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel it for exactly as long as she intended to, which was about 7 minutes. She knew the shape of grief. She knew how to let it exist without letting it take over. You sat with it. You breathed. You didn't pretend it wasn't there. Then you figured out what came next. She had enough money for maybe 3 nights in this room. After that, she had no clear answer. There was no going back to St. Louis. Not because she was too proud, but because there was nothing left to go back to. Her apartment was given up. Her job was given up. She had made a decision and traveled 3 days on the back of it and ended up here, in a cracked basin room in a frontier town where she was already a joke. She washed her face. She looked out the window at the street below, where the light was going orange and the day was cooling off. She thought about her mother. Not with sentimentality exactly, but practically. Her mother had been a woman who got through things. Not beautifully, not without complaining, not with the kind of quiet grace that made for good stories. She'd gotten through things with a particular stubbornness that wasn't glamorous but got the job done. She used to say, "You don't have to feel steady to keep walking. You just have to keep walking." Evelyn pulled off her shoes and lay down on the bed in her dress and stared at the ceiling. She was still looking at the ceiling when she heard something slide under her door. She sat up, looked at it. A folded piece of paper, slightly worn, like it had been carried in a pocket for a while. She crossed the room and picked it up. It was not what she expected. It was short, and it was written in handwriting that pressed too hard on some letters and went light on others, like the person wasn't used to writing but was trying to be careful. Miss Hart, I am not offering marriage. I want to be plain about that before anything else. I have 2 children, 8 years old, twins, a girl and a boy. I have a ranch 3 miles from town. Since my wife passed 14 months ago now, things have gotten difficult. I need someone reliable to help care for the children and keep the house. I can pay a small wage and provide room and board. I understand if this isn't what you came here for, but if you need a place and you're willing to work, I need someone who is. Silas Rowan. She read it twice, then she read it a 3rd time, slowly, looking for the part that was a trap. The whole town had watched 3 men throw her away like she was something that hadn't been what they ordered. And now here was a 4th man sliding paper under her door in the evening, not offering marriage, not offering much of anything besides work and a roof. And frankly, she'd slept in this room for 4 hours and already hated the ceiling. She thought about it for longer than it should have taken. The practical case was obvious. She had very little money and no plan, and this was a paying position. But practicality wasn't the only thing moving inside her. There was something else, something she couldn't name cleanly. A feeling like this folded piece of paper with its uneven handwriting was somehow more honest than every letter she'd spent 3 months exchanging with men who turned out to be strangers to themselves. She got up. She didn't have a great deal to pack since she'd only half unpacked. She pulled on her shoes. She smoothed her dress. She wrote a single line on the back of the paper. "I'll be at breakfast. Tell me where to find you." She folded it and went downstairs and asked the man at the front desk if he knew Silas Rowan. The man looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was the Dry Creek look, the careful assessment of a small town sizing up someone it doesn't know what to do with yet. "Everyone knows Silas," the man said. "Then would you see that he gets this?" A pause. "He's not an easy man," the desk clerk said, like this was a service he was providing. "Neither am I," she said. "The note, please." He took it. She went back upstairs. She lay down on the bed again, and this time she actually thought about what she was doing. She was considering taking a job. Not a marriage, a job. With a widowed man she'd never met, who had children she'd never met, on a ranch she'd never seen, 3 miles from a town that had already decided what kind of woman she was. She thought about Thomas Greer's voice carrying across that street. All three of us turned her down. She thought about Carter Miles looking at her like she was an application he was processing. She thought about Harold Fenn's slow, almost gentle dismissal, which was somehow worse than the others because it had no heat in it, just tiredness. And she thought, none of that is who I am. None of them had the faintest idea who she was. A man with two motherless 8-year-olds and a ranch falling apart was not what she'd planned. But she hadn't planned on a lot of things. She hadn't planned on her mother dying at 61. She hadn't planned on being the kind of woman who answered advertisements in newspapers. She hadn't planned on standing in the dust of a frontier street while a man used her like a punchline. You don't have to feel steady to keep walking. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would meet Silas Rowan. She didn't know yet what that would cost her, or what it would give her, or that in 14 months of grief, he had become a man made entirely of closed doors, closed to comfort, closed to hope, barely open to his own children. She didn't know about Rose and her stubborn silence, or her brother's furious, misplaced loyalty to a memory he was too young to fully hold. She didn't know about the night that was coming, months from now, the night that would push all of them past the edge of what they thought they could survive. She only knew what the note had said. I need someone reliable. She was that, at least. She had always been that. She fell asleep with her shoes still on and her planning face still working, even in the dark, even in the silence of a town that had already decided it knew exactly who she was. It didn't know anything yet. She wore the same dress to breakfast that she'd slept in because she only had two and she wasn't about to waste the clean one on a meal she wasn't sure she'd be able to afford. The hotel dining room was small and smelled like old coffee and bacon grease, which was not an unpleasant combination at 7 in the morning. 3 tables. 2 of them occupied by men who glanced up when she walked in, did their assessment, and looked back at their food. She was already old news in Dry Creek, apparently. The woman all 3 men had rejected. 24 hours hadn't passed, and she already had a reputation. She sat at the empty table and ordered coffee and whatever was cheapest, which turned out to be 2 eggs and a heel of bread, and she was halfway through the eggs when the door opened. She knew it was him before he said anything. Not because he looked like what she'd imagined. She hadn't let herself imagine much. But because of the way he came in. Cautious, like a man who'd learned to check the temperature of a room before committing to it. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in 3 or 4 days, and the kind of tiredness that lives behind the eyes rather than in the body. The body tiredness you can sleep off. The other kind accumulates. He was maybe 34, 35. He looked older. He spotted her. She was the only woman sitting alone, and came over and pulled out the chair across from her without asking, which she didn't mind. The asking could turn into a whole performance. Miss Hart. Mr. Rowan. He sat down, didn't order anything, just put his hands on the table, looked at them for a moment, then looked at her. I wasn't sure you'd still be here. Where else would I be? He didn't have an answer for that, which suggested he'd thought about it and hadn't come up with one either. I want to be straight with you, he said. You were straight in your note. I appreciated it. The note was the easy part. He shifted in his chair. The chair scraped the floor and he winced slightly at the sound, like a man used to quiet. The situation at the ranch is bad. I don't mean difficult. I mean it's genuinely bad. The house has been let go. The children are... He stopped, started again. My son, Caleb, he's going to be a problem. He's 8 years old and he's already decided any woman who comes to the house is an insult to his mother's memory. He'll be rude. He may be worse than rude. And your daughter? Something moved in his face. Rose doesn't talk much anymore. She used to, before. He didn't explain before. He didn't need to. Evelyn drank her coffee. What happened to your wife? It was a direct question, maybe too direct. But she'd spent 3 months writing careful, measured letters to men who'd turned out to be strangers, and she was done being careful with strangers. Fever, he said. Came on fast. Nearest doctor was nearly a day's ride. By the time he got there, he pressed his mouth shut. The muscle in his jaw moved. 14 months ago. I'm sorry. I don't need sympathy, he said. Not unkindly, more like a man who'd received a lot of it and found it didn't help with the actual problem. All right, she said. What do you need? He looked at her like he was recalibrating something. Someone who won't leave in 2 weeks. Someone who can handle the children without trying to replace their mother. Someone who isn't going to expect the place to be something it isn't right now. And in exchange? Room and board and $6 a month. I know that's not... It's enough, she said. It was barely enough, but barely enough was better than what she had now, which was nothing. He nodded, looked at his hands again. I should tell you something else. The town, what happened yesterday. People talk here. They're going to talk about you being at the ranch. A single woman, a widowed man. They'll make it into whatever they want to make it into. Mr. Rowan, she said, they were already talking about me before I'd been here 4 hours. I don't have a reputation left to protect in this town. What I have left is a decision to make. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when can you be ready? I need to settle my bill here, she said. 20 minutes. He nodded and stood up, then paused. My children haven't been told yet. I wasn't sure you'd agree. That's a conversation for you to have with them before I arrive, she said. Give me that much of a head start. Something passed across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. Fair enough, he said. He left. She finished her eggs. The ride out to the ranch was 3 miles of dirt road and awkward silence because Silas Rowan was not a man who talked to fill space. She sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the land open up around them, dry grass and low scrub, and a sky so wide it felt like a statement. She'd grown up in a city. She wasn't used to that much sky. She noticed the way he handled the horse, not roughly, but without sentiment either. Practical. The way you handle something you depend on. How long have you ranched? She asked, just to hear something human. Bought the land when I was 22. 8 years, give or take. By yourself? With my wife. A beat. Then with myself. She left that alone. When the ranch came into view, she understood what he'd meant about bad. It wasn't a ruin. It was worse than a ruin in a way, because it had clearly been a good house once. You could see the bones of it. The proportions were right, the structure was sound, but the porch had a broken rail that had never been repaired. The kitchen garden was a tangle of overgrowth, and there was a general feeling of a place that had been maintaining itself at the bare minimum, while the person who was supposed to care for it had been spending all his energy on just getting through the days. She didn't say any of this. She just looked. 2 children were standing on the porch. One of them, the girl, she assumed, was standing very still, watching the wagon approach with wide, dark eyes that had the careful blankness of a child who'd learned to hold her face still. The boy stood with his arms crossed, which was such an adult posture on an 8-year-old that it would have been almost funny if the anger behind it hadn't been so obviously real. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He looked up at the children. Caleb, Rose, this is Miss Hart. She's going to be helping us for a while. The girl, Rose, said nothing. Her eyes moved to Evelyn with that same careful blankness. The boy, Caleb, looked at her with an expression that was not blank at all. It was specific and pointed. We don't need help, he said. Caleb, Silas's voice was flat with warning. We don't, the boy said again. He was looking at Evelyn like she was something his father had tracked in on his boot. We were fine. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon. She picked up her bag. She looked at Caleb, not around him, not past him, directly at him, and she said, I know you were. He blinked. That wasn't what he'd been ready for. I'm not here because you couldn't manage, she said. I'm here because your father's got a ranch to run and 2 kids to raise, and there's not enough hours in the day for all of it. That's not a failure. That's just math. She looked at Rose then. Is there a room I could put my things in? Rose glanced at her father. Silas nodded. Rose stepped off the porch and walked past Evelyn. Not rudely, but with a silence so complete it was almost physical, and went inside. Evelyn followed her. Caleb didn't move from his spot on the porch. She could feel him watching her back as she went in. The room she was given was small and faced west. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the back of the property where the land went flat and gold in the afternoon light. She set her bag on the bed and stood there for a moment, just breathing. Rose was standing in the doorway, watching her. Thank you, Evelyn said, for showing me. Rose nodded once. Then, very quietly, in a voice that sounded slightly out of practice, Mama's things aren't in here anymore. Papa moved them. Evelyn looked at her carefully. That must have been hard. Rose considered this. He cried, she said. He didn't know I saw. She said it without drama, just as a fact she'd been carrying somewhere and had now set down. Then she turned and walked away down the hall. Evelyn stood in the room and felt the particular weight of a house full of grief and tried to think about what was practical. Because the grief was real, and the children were real, and the broken porch rail was real, and none of those things were going to sort themselves out while she stood here feeling the weight of them. She unpacked her bag. She changed her dress. And then she went to find the kitchen. Well, the kitchen was the worst room in the house. Not dirty exactly, more like abandoned, like someone had been doing the minimum required to produce food and nothing else. There were dishes that had been washed but put away wrong, flour that had been stored in a damp spot and started to cake, a stove that worked but hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The table had a layer of grime on it that wasn't visible at first glance, but showed up when she ran a finger across it. She stood in that kitchen for a while, looking at it. Not with despair. With something more like attention. She found a rag. She found soap. She got the stove burning properly and put water on to heat, and she started with the table because you had to start somewhere, and the table was the center of things. You eat at a table. You talk at a table. You do homework and play cards and have arguments and make decisions at a table. A clean table wasn't just a surface. It was a message. This room is being attended to now. Someone is paying attention. She was on her knees scrubbing the floor near the stove when she heard boots on the floorboards behind her. She didn't stop. You don't have to do all that today, Silas said from the doorway. I know, she said, but I don't have anything else to do today. A pause. I've got to check on the eastern fence. One of the hands said it came down in last week's wind. I'll be back by supper. What do the children usually eat for supper? Another pause, this one longer. Whatever I managed to put together. She sat back on her heels and looked at him over her shoulder. He had the expression of a man who'd just admitted something he hadn't intended to. I'll make supper, she said. He nodded and left. She could hear him call something to Caleb outside, and then the sound of hoofbeats moving away. She found dried beans and a ham bone and some onions that were more ambitious than fresh but would do, and she got a pot going on the stove. Then she went back to the floor. Oh. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway an hour later. She saw him in her peripheral vision and kept doing what she was doing, which was reorganizing the shelf where the dry goods were stored. He stood there long enough that it was clearly intentional. He wanted her to notice him noticing her, wanted some kind of confrontation. She took her time. You're moving things, he said finally. The flour was going damp where it was, she said, and the sugar was next to the lamp oil, which isn't a good idea. Mama put things there. She turned and looked at him fully. He was small for 8, with his father's dark eyes and a set to his jaw that would have gotten him in trouble in any schoolroom she'd ever heard of. He was also, very clearly, a child who was scared and furious about being scared, and was using the fury to cover the fear. She recognized it because she'd spent 4 years watching her mother manage the same equation at a completely different scale. I know, she said, and I'm not changing where things are because your mama was wrong. She probably had good reasons. Things just shifted over time. You don't know what she had reasons for. No, she agreed. I don't. I never met her. She paused. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing. That disarmed him slightly. He'd been ready for her to argue, or to be kind in the practiced, empty way that adults were kind when they wanted a child to stop causing problems. He wasn't ready for plain acknowledgement. She was, he said, quieter. Tell me one thing about her, Evelyn said. Something you don't want to forget. He stared at her, suspicious. Why? Because I'm going to be in this house for a while, and I don't want to accidentally move something that matters. A partial truth. Mostly true enough. I was quiet for a long moment. Then, she used to sing when she made bread. Not real songs. Just sounds. Like she was making up a song while she did it. He stopped. His throat moved. I can't remember exactly what it sounded like anymore. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then, that's the thing about sounds. They go first. She turned back to the shelf. The beans will be ready in a couple hours. If you want, you can tell me when your father gets back. She heard him stand there a moment longer. Then his boots moved away from the doorway. She exhaled slowly and kept working. Supper was not a success, exactly, but it wasn't a failure either, which given the circumstances she counted as a reasonable outcome. Silas came in from the eastern fence in a mood that was dark around the edges. The fence had been worse than reported. 2 of his cattle had wandered through the gap, and he'd spent an hour more than expected tracking them down. He sat at the table with the posture of a man who was present in body only. Rose sat across from him and ate in her usual silence, but she ate, which Evelyn was beginning to understand was not always a given. Caleb sat next to his father and managed to direct no words at Evelyn whatsoever, which was an improvement over hostility. "The beans are good," Silas said, which from him seemed to be the equivalent of a formal compliment. "Hambone helped," she said. "I didn't know we had one." "It was in the back of the larder." She didn't say that it had been wrapped in cloth that was starting to go bad around it, and she'd salvaged it by maybe a day, because that felt like an unnecessary detail at a first supper. After the children went to bed, Silas handled that, and she heard him through the wall, reading to them in a voice that was quieter than his daytime voice, less guarded. She washed the supper dishes. She heard him come down the hall and pause at the kitchen door. "You don't have to do those tonight," he said. "You've said that twice today," she replied. "I notice things are different when they're dealt with instead of set aside." A long pause. "That's a particular way of saying I've been letting things go." "It's a way of saying the house is going to take some work, and I'd rather start now than later." She set a clean bowl on the shelf. "I'm not criticizing you, Mr. Rowan. You've been managing a cattle operation and 2 grieving children for 14 months. Something had to give. The kitchen gave." She heard him shift his weight in the doorway. "You can call me Silas, if you're going to be here." "All right," she said. "Silas. Miss Hart. Evelyn." "Evelyn." He said her name like he was testing the weight of it. "I need you to understand, Rose is doing better than she was 6 months ago. She used to not eat at all. And Caleb, I talked to Caleb today," she said. "He told me his mother used to hum when she made bread." The silence that followed was different from the other silences in that house. This one had something raw in it. "She did," he said. After a moment, "He talked to you." "A little." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to. She heard him say goodnight and walk down the hall to his room. She heard his door close. She dried her hands on a towel and stood in the clean kitchen for a moment. The stove was banked down for the night. The table was scrubbed. The dry goods were stored in places that made sense. It wasn't fixed. It was one kitchen in one evening, and there were 5 more rooms in various states of neglect, and a porch rail that needed replacing, and a child who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since she arrived, and another who was carrying enough grief for a grown man. But the table was clean, and supper had happened, and a boy who'd crossed his arms on a porch and decided she was the enemy had told her something he was afraid to forget. You worked with what you had. You started where you could start. She went to her room and took off her shoes and lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling, which was different from the hotel ceiling in a way she couldn't quite name. Less hostile, maybe. Or maybe that was just her adjusting. She thought about what Caleb had said. She used to sing when she made bread. Not real songs, just sounds. She thought about a woman she'd never met, who had stood in that kitchen and hummed things she made up, and had no idea that 14 months later, a stranger would be sleeping in the spare room trying to figure out how to be useful without being an intrusion. She thought, I'm not here to replace anyone. And then, because she was practical to her core and she needed to sleep, she thought about what she was going to do about the garden tomorrow, which was going to need turning before it could produce anything, and the soil looked like it hadn't been worked in over a year. The days that followed didn't transform. They accumulated. That was the honest word for it. Not transformation. Accumulation. One clean room, then another. One repaired thing, then something else. She fixed the broken porch rail on the 3rd day because she'd watched Caleb catch his sleeve on the splintered wood twice, and she was tired of waiting for someone to get hurt. She found a hammer and nails in the barn, and she'd done enough watching of repairs in her life to manage it, badly, in a way that held. Silas came home that evening and stopped at the porch and looked at the rail for a long moment. She was inside, so she didn't see his face. She just heard him stop. He didn't say anything about it at supper. But later, when she was in the kitchen, he came in and set a small jar of preserves on the counter next to her. Rose wanted you to have these, he said. She made them last fall. I don't think she was ready to share them before now. Evelyn looked at the jar. Blackberry, from the color. She looked up. Tell her thank you. Tell her yourself, he said. She's still up. She found Rose in the small sitting room, sitting in a chair with her knees pulled up, turning a piece of string over and over in her hands. The girl looked up when Evelyn came in. Your father says these are from you, Evelyn said, holding up the jar. Rose nodded. I'll use them carefully, Evelyn said. They must have taken a while to make. Mama showed me, Rose said. Then, as if this needed no additional comment, she looked back at her string. Evelyn sat down in the other chair. She didn't try to talk, she just sat. After a minute, Rose started showing her the string pattern she'd been making, a looping figure-8 thing that she'd learned somewhere and was trying to teach herself to do faster. Evelyn watched. Eventually, Rose handed her one end of the string and showed her what to do. And Evelyn did it wrong twice, and right on the third try. Rose almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The town didn't stay quiet. She'd expected it, but expectation doesn't make a thing comfortable. On her first trip into Dry Creek to pick up flour and sugar, 2 weeks after arriving at the ranch, she walked into the general store, and the conversation near the front counter dropped by about half its volume, which was worse than if it had stopped entirely because it meant people were still talking, just more careful about it. A woman named Margaret Holt, who ran the millinery and had opinions about everything, looked at her over a bolt of cloth and said, How long are you planning to stay out at the Rowan place? As long as I'm needed, Evelyn said, and kept looking at the flour sacks. People are talking, Margaret said, which was less an observation than a warning shot. I know, Evelyn said. People talked before I'd been in town 4 hours. It doesn't seem to have slowed down. She looked up from the flour. Is there something specific you'd like to say to me, Mrs. Holt? Margaret Holt drew herself up with the particular dignity of a woman who's spent years being the person who says the quiet part loud. I think it's unusual. A single woman living on a widower's property. I'm his household help, Evelyn said. I cook and clean and care for his children. Is that an unusual thing to need? It depends on, because if you know someone in town who would have done it, Evelyn continued, in a voice that was mild as water. I'd genuinely like to know why they didn't. Those children have been without proper care for over a year. Margaret Holt closed her mouth, then opened it again. Then seemed to decide she wasn't quite ready to finish that sentence and closed it again. Evelyn bought her flour and left. Outside, she stood on the front step and let herself feel the irritation for about 10 seconds. Not longer, not shorter. Then she packed it away and walked back toward the wagon. Thomas Greer was coming the other direction on the sidewalk. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. There was a pause that both of them felt. He looked like a man who was doing a rapid calculation about whether to cross the street and decided it was too late. Miss Hart, he said. Mr. Greer. She kept walking. I heard you've taken a position at the Rowan Ranch, he said to her back. She stopped, turned around. You heard right. It's good that you found something, he said, and he seemed to mean it sincerely, which was somehow more irritating than if he'd been snide. Like he was pleased things had worked out for her, as if her ending up in Dry Creek was a story he'd had some pleasant role in. Good day, Mr. Greer, she said. She didn't wait for him to finish whatever he'd been thinking of adding. She was done collecting the opinions of men who hadn't taken 5 minutes to actually look at her. Well, Caleb came around slower than Rose, and less completely, and more honestly, which was to say, he didn't have a quiet moment with a jar of preserves. He had an argument about whether she had the right to reorganize the barn storage, which she did not technically have a claim to but had done anyway because 3 saddles on the same hook was an accident waiting to happen. He was 8 years old and he argued like a lawyer, which would have been funny if it hadn't been so exhausting. You changed where everything is, he said, standing in the middle of the barn with his arms crossed, which was his default posture where she was concerned. Nobody asked you to. Your father asked me to help with the house, she said. The barn was getting dangerous. It wasn't dangerous, I knew where everything was. You almost walked into a pitchfork 2 days ago, she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. That doesn't mean you get to move everything. I didn't move everything, she said, keeping her voice level. I moved 3 saddles and a coil of rope that was on the floor. The pitchfork is where it was. She looked at him. Caleb, I know this is hard. Don't, he said. His voice went flat and young and furious all at once. Don't what? Don't say it's hard like you know what hard is. He was looking at her with everything he had: grief, rage, the particular exhausted look of a child who'd been told it would be okay too many times and had stopped believing it. You weren't here. You don't know what it was like. You don't know anything about us. She let that sit for a moment. Let it breathe. You're right, she said. I don't. I wasn't here and I don't know what the last 14 months were like, and I'm not going to pretend I do. She paused. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere unless you give me a reason to, and so far being rude hasn't worked, and moving the saddles hasn't made you leave either. He stared at her. She could see him recalculating. I'm not trying to take anything from you, she said. Not one single thing. I'm trying to put a few things back. She picked up the bucket she'd come for originally. Supper's in an hour. Rabbit stew. Your father said you like it. She walked out of the barn and left him standing there. That night at supper, Caleb passed her the bread without being asked. It was a small thing. The kind of small thing that doesn't look like much from the outside. But she'd been paying attention long enough to know what it cost him, and she took the bread and said thank you in a voice that didn't make a production of it, and that was enough for one evening. Outside, the frontier night came down hard and cold and complete. The stars were different out here than in St. Louis. More of them, or maybe just more visible, without the city light to wash them out. She stood on the clean porch for a moment before going in, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee, and she looked out at the dark land. 14 months ago, a woman had stood somewhere on this property, and none of them had been ready to lose her. And now a stranger from Missouri was sleeping in the spare room and fixing porch rails and making rabbit stew, and somehow life had gone right on. She didn't have a neat thought about that. She just let it be what it was. Then she went inside because the fire was getting low and someone had to bank it for the night, and she was the one still awake. The first real sign came on a Tuesday, which was a day like any other until it wasn't. Evelyn had been at the ranch 6 weeks by then. 6 weeks of accumulated small things, clean floors and mended curtains and suppers that happened on time. Of Caleb's arms uncrossing by small degrees, and Rose's voice coming back slowly, word by word, like a creek that had been frozen and was now remembering how to move. 6 weeks of Silas coming home from the range and eating at a table that was set properly for the first time in over a year, and not saying much but not being absent in the way he'd been absent at the beginning, when he sat at that table like a man who'd shown up out of obligation and was waiting to be excused. 6 weeks was enough time to start feeling like something, not permanent, not even close to permanent, but something. The sign was this. Rose didn't come down to breakfast. She was always down first, actually, earlier than Caleb, earlier than Silas, sometimes before Evelyn had the stove properly going. She would sit at the table with her hands in her lap and watch the kitchen come to life. Not talking, but present in a way that had started to feel, to Evelyn, like a kind of trust. So when the stove was hot, and the coffee was made, and Caleb appeared in the doorway still pulling on his boot, and Rose was not behind him, Evelyn noticed. "Where's your sister?" she asked. Caleb looked up. Something shifted in his face. "She was still in bed when I got up. I thought she was sleeping in." Evelyn dried her hands and went upstairs. Rose was in bed, which she never was at this hour, and the moment Evelyn put her hand to the girl's forehead, she felt it. The heat that was wrong, the kind that sat under the skin and radiated out and told you immediately that this was not a regular morning sickness, not a stomachache, not a child who wanted to avoid something. Rose opened her eyes. They were glassy and too bright. "I'm cold," she said, which didn't match the heat coming off her skin. "I know, sweetheart," Evelyn said, and the word came out before she'd decided to say it, and Rose didn't seem to mind. "I'm going to get you some water." She went back downstairs with her face carefully arranged because Caleb was at the bottom of the stairs watching her. And he read expressions the way some children read words, quickly and accurately and with full comprehension. "How bad?" he asked. He was 8 years old and he asked it like a man. "Fever," she said. "I need you to go get your father. He's at the east pasture?" "North today." He was already moving toward the door. "Caleb." He stopped. "Don't run the horse hard. Take your time going. She's not in danger right this moment, and your father doesn't need to come home thinking the worst." She paused. "But bring him home." He nodded and was gone. She went back upstairs with water and a cloth. Silas was back within 40 minutes, which meant Caleb had in fact pushed the horse a little despite what she'd said. And she chose not to address it because the look on Silas's face when he came through the door told her he'd been riding in a particular kind of controlled panic that she recognized. The kind where you tell yourself it's probably nothing while your body behaves like it's definitely something. He went straight upstairs. She let him go. She heard him up there with Rose, heard his voice low, and then the girl's voice, thinner than usual but audible. She got the fire going higher, put more water on, found the small kit she'd brought with her from St. Louis that she'd used during her mother's illness. Not much in it, but the basics. Willow bark, cloth for compresses, a small bottle of something her mother's doctor had recommended for fevers that she'd refilled twice and had been carrying out of habit more than expectation. Silas came back down. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and his face had a particular blankness on it that she understood was not calm. It was the face of a man trying to stay functional. "I need to ride for Dr. Hennessy," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "How far?" "Best case, 8 hours there and back, if he's in town and not out on a call." He looked at her. The look had a question in it that he didn't ask directly, which was, "Can you manage this while I'm gone?" "Go," she said. "I've got her." He didn't move immediately. His eyes went to the stairs, then back to her. "This is how it started," he said. Low, careful, like he was placing each word down one at a time. "With Clara. The fever came the same way, and then—" "I know," she said. She didn't, not exactly, but she knew enough. She knew what he was not saying, which was, "I watched it happen before, and I couldn't stop it, and I cannot watch it happen again. Silas, I need you to go get the doctor, and I need you to trust me to take care of her while you do. That's the only division of this problem that makes sense. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, tight and small, and went back out. She listened to the hoofbeats fade down the road toward Dry Creek. Then she went upstairs. She'd cared for her mother through 2 bad winters and one that was worse. She knew fevers. She knew the way they climbed and the way they plateaued and the particular danger zone where the heat got high enough to do damage and the patient started going somewhere you couldn't follow. She knew the importance of keeping the body cool without shocking it, of getting water in when the person would take it, of staying awake through the hours when giving in to exhaustion felt like the most reasonable thing in the world. She knew all of this not from any formal training, but from 4 years of necessity, 4 years of sitting beside a bed and figuring things out and sometimes getting it wrong and correcting and trying again. Rose was 8 years old and small for her age, and the fever by mid-morning had climbed in a way that made Evelyn's jaw tighten. She kept her voice even. "Can you drink this for me?" "It tastes bad," Rose said. "It does," she agreed. "Drink it anyway." Rose drank it, made a face. Evelyn smoothed the damp cloth across her forehead. The girl's hair was dark with sweat, stuck to her temples, and her eyes when they were open had that wrong quality, too present and too far away at the same time. "Am I going to be like Mama?" Rose asked. Evelyn kept her hands moving, kept her voice where she needed it to be. "No," she said. Not with false brightness, not with the practiced reassurance of someone who didn't know, just flat and certain, the way you said something when you intended to make it true. Rose looked at her for a moment, then her eyes drifted closed. Caleb appeared in the doorway. He'd been in and out all morning, hovering, unable to stay away and unable to stay either. He looked at his sister and his face was doing the thing where he was trying very hard not to show what was happening in it. "She looks worse," he said. "The fever's up," Evelyn said. "That's expected. It gets worse before it turns." "Does it always turn?" She looked at him. "I'm going to make sure it turns." "That's not an answer." "Caleb," she kept her voice steady, "I need you to do something useful. Can you do that?" He nodded, less because he was satisfied and more because having a task was better than standing there helpless. "Get me the clean linens from the trunk at the end of the hall, all of them, and fill the pitcher again." She paused. "And eat something. There's bread on the counter. I need you functional, not hungry." He went. She heard him on the stairs, heard him in the hall, heard the sound of the trunk being opened. She wrung out the cloth and laid it again on Rose's forehead and looked at the girl's face and felt the particular weight of a promise she'd made to herself in the first 3 seconds of understanding what this was. Not this child. Not in this house. Not again. By afternoon, the fever had climbed higher. She didn't let herself think about what that meant in one direction. She thought about it only in terms of what to do next. The compress. The water. Getting too warm. Keep the child from shivering so hard she exhausted herself. Talk when Rose was awake enough to hear, because the voice of another person was something. She'd learned this with her mother. The voice was something that connected a sick person to the world and gave them a reason to stay in it. "Tell me about the blackberries," she said, when Rose's eyes came open again in the late afternoon. Rose blinked. Her voice was rough. "What?" "The preserves you gave me. Where did you pick them?" A long pause. Rose was working to focus. "Southfield. There's a whole row of them along the fence." "Your mother showed you?" Her eyes were drifting. "She said you had to wait until they were completely black, not just dark. Black. Or they're too sour." "Smart woman," Evelyn said. "What else did she teach you?" Rose talked haltingly in fragments. About bread and about the way to check if a jar was sealed right, and about a song, her mother's song, not words exactly, just a melody that Rose couldn't reproduce but kept reaching for, kept describing the shape of. She talked about it until she fell asleep mid-sentence, and Evelyn sat beside her and changed the compress and listened to her breathe. Caleb came in at some point and sat on the floor in the corner without being invited or told to leave. He pulled his knees up and watched. She didn't make him go. Outside, the afternoon light went orange and then gray and then dark. By midnight, the fever hadn't broken. Evelyn had been awake for 19 hours. She was not going to do the math on how many more there might be. She sat in the chair beside Rose's bed with her spine straight, because if she let herself relax into the chair, she would fall asleep, and she was not going to fall asleep. Caleb had fallen asleep on the floor around 10, finally, his head on his folded arms. She'd put a blanket over him rather than send him to his room, because she understood that he needed to be in the same space as his sister, needed to hear her breathing. She understood that completely. Around 1 in the morning, Rose's breathing changed, got faster, shallower. Evelyn was on her feet before she'd fully registered why. She put her hand to Rose's forehead and felt the heat spike, felt it in her own palm like touching something left in the sun. "Rose," she said. "Rose, I need you to open your eyes." Rose's eyelids fluttered, didn't open. "Rose." She kept her voice calm. She was not calm. She was the opposite of calm in a place underneath where her voice was coming from, but the voice stayed level because that was the only thing she could give this child right now, and she was going to give it. "Rosie, look at me." The girl's eyes came open, barely, found her face. "There you are," Evelyn said. "Stay with me. Just stay here." She worked. She changed every compress. She got water into the girl in small, careful amounts. She talked. Not about anything meaningful, just words. Just the sound of a human voice telling a child that the room was real, and the bed was real, and there was someone sitting right here who was not going anywhere. She talked about St. Louis and about the way the river looked in summer, and about her mother's kitchen, and the smell of the bread her mother made. And she was aware that she was giving Rose something she'd only been given herself by absence, a mother's presence at the bed, the particular comfort of someone who stayed. She thought about Clara Rowan, who had lain in this same bed, or one very close to it, with a fever that hadn't turned, who had had Silas beside her and 2 7-year-olds who didn't understand what was happening, who had not had someone in the chair who knew what to do. Evelyn was not Clara. She was not trying to be Clara. But she was here, and she knew what she was doing, and that was going to have to be enough. At 2 in the morning, Caleb woke up on the floor. He sat up and looked at his sister and looked at Evelyn, and his face in the low lamplight was very young and very frightened. "Is she? She's fighting," Evelyn said. "That's what this is. This is her fighting." "What can I do?" She looked at him. He was 8 years old, and he'd been carrying things too heavy for 8 years old for over a year, and she was going to tell him the truth. "You can sit with her and hold her hand, so she knows you're here." "That's not nothing, Caleb. That's one of the most important things."
He got up from the floor and came to the bed and sat on the edge of it and took his sister's hand with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew how to be gentle when it mattered. Rose didn't open her eyes, but her fingers moved, closed slightly around his. Evelyn watched this and felt something in her chest that was not grief exactly, and not hope exactly, but something that lived between the two.
She almost lost the battle against her own body at around 3. Her eyes started closing without her permission, the way they do when exhaustion stops asking and starts taking. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the window and back. She pressed her palms against the cool wood of the window sill. She thought about her mother in the last winter, thought about the night she'd sat beside her when the fever spiked and the breathing went wrong, thought about the particular clarity that comes when you're too tired to be scared anymore, and all that's left is the next thing, and then the next. She sat back down. She changed the compress. She talked to Rose in a low voice about nothing and everything, and Caleb sat on the other side of the bed with his sister's hand in both of his and didn't sleep either. Around 4 in the morning, there was a sound downstairs. The front door. Silas. She heard him on the stairs, heard the heaviness of a man who'd ridden hard both ways and was running on nothing but fear. And then he was in the doorway with Dr. Hennessy behind him, a compact older man with a gray beard and a bag that suggested he'd made this ride many times before. Silas looked at Rose, then at Evelyn. His face asked the question. "She's still with us," Evelyn said. "The fever peaked around 1. I think—" She stopped herself because she wasn't certain, and she didn't trade in things she wasn't certain of. Dr. Hennessy came to the bed. He was quiet and efficient, the way experienced doctors are when they're managing their own reaction to what they're seeing. He checked the girl, asked several questions that Evelyn answered fully, and then looked at the compress setup and the water and the small kit on the bedside table with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but was something adjacent to approval. "Willow bark," he said. "Yes, since this morning." "How often have you been changing the compresses?" "Every 15 to 20 minutes through the night." He looked at her. "You've done this before." "My mother," she said. He nodded, turned back to Rose. He opened his bag, produced something she didn't recognize, administered it with the practiced quiet of a man who'd done it 100 times in rooms just like this one. Then he stood back. "Now we wait," he said. "We've been waiting," Caleb said from the other side of the bed. His voice was flat with exhaustion and something close to defiance. The doctor looked at him. "I can see that," he said, not unkindly. "You've been doing good work, son." Caleb didn't respond to that. He just kept holding his sister's hand. Silas had come to stand beside Evelyn, not close, but within a foot of her, and she was aware of him in the way you're aware of something that has weight. He was looking at Rose, his jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the thing she'd seen them do before. The controlled blankness of a man keeping himself together by pure force. She didn't say anything to him. There was nothing to say that would help, and she wasn't going to say something useless just to fill the silence. The fever broke just before dawn. There was no dramatic announcement, no single moment where everything shifted. It was just that Evelyn put her hand to Rose's forehead at 5:30 and felt it. The heat was still there, but less, receding, like something that had been pushing against a door and had finally, slowly, stepped back. She checked again, then again. Then she said quietly, "Silas." He was across the room, sitting against the wall with his arms on his knees, and he was awake instantly the way people are when they haven't really slept. He came to the bed. She took his hand and put it on Rose's forehead without explaining why, and she watched his face. The thing that happened in his face was private, and she didn't look at it for long. He pressed his hand to his daughter's forehead, and his eyes closed, and he stayed like that for a moment. Just a moment. Then Rose's eyes came open, clearer than they'd been in 24 hours, tired and weak and thin, but clear. "Papa," she said. "Yeah," he said. His voice had come undone somewhere, and he was working with what was left of it. "Yeah, right here." Caleb, who had been asleep finally, slumped against the headboard with his sister's hand still loosely in his, woke up at the sound of her voice. He looked at Rose. Rose looked at him. Some communication happened between them that was entirely beyond words, the particular shorthand of twins who have been through something together and don't need to name it. Dr. Hennessy examined Rose again in the early morning light and made the sounds of a man who was satisfied and slightly surprised to be so. He spoke to Silas in the hallway afterward, and Evelyn stayed with the children, but she heard a few words through the door. Severity was one of them. Intervention was another. Then, clearly, without the care she received through the night, I cannot say with confidence the outcome would have been the same. She heard Silas go quiet after that, heard the doctor say something else she couldn't make out. Then the sound of boots on the stairs as they came back down. Bob. She was in the kitchen, finally sitting down with a cup of coffee she hadn't had the chance to drink while it was still hot, when Silas came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just stood there. She looked up. He looked like a man who had been through a storm and was standing in the aftermath of it, trying to take stock. His hair was disordered, his eyes were red at the edges, though she would not have pointed that out. He had the look of someone who had words but was sorting through them, trying to find the right ones, and was not confident he was going to find them. "I don't know how to—" he started. Stopped. "You don't have to," she said. "Evelyn." He said her name the way he'd said it that first morning at the breakfast table, like he was learning the weight of it. She could have— He stopped again. "If you hadn't been here—" "I was here," she said, simply, flatly, not as a point to make, but as a fact. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. Not across, actually. The kitchen table wasn't large enough for across to mean much. He sat beside her, almost, and put his hands on the table and looked at them the way he sometimes did when he was thinking hard. "She asked me last night if she was going to be like her mother," Evelyn said. He looked up. "I told her no." She held his gaze. "I meant it." He was quiet for a long moment, then, "I know you did." He paused. "I know you did because you sat up all night making it true." The kitchen was warm from the stove. Outside, the dawn light was coming in clean and pale through the window, the particular light of a morning that has no idea what the night before it held. The coffee had gone cold, and she drank it anyway. Silas looked at her, and she looked back, and something passed between them that neither of them named, because they were both too tired and too raw, and the moment was too large for naming. It was just there. Something that had been building in the way that things build when you live alongside someone through ordinary days and then extraordinary ones. When you see each other clearly and keep showing up anyway. He looked away first, not because he wanted to. She had the impression, more than an impression really, that he looked away because he wasn't ready for where looking wouldn't have stopped. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll sit with Rose." "Caleb's with her." "I know. I'll sit with both of them." He stood. At the kitchen door he paused, one hand on the frame, not turning all the way around. "Evelyn, thank you doesn't cover it." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but it's a start." She heard him go upstairs. She sat in the warm kitchen with her cold coffee and the growing morning light, and felt the exhaustion settle through her like something solid, like something she'd earned. Her hands were on the table in front of her, and she looked at them. Rougher than when she'd come, reddened from the water and the compresses and the work. Her mother's hands had looked like that. She'd never noticed before that she had her mother's hands. Outside, a bird started somewhere in the direction of the south field. One clear note, then several, then something that wasn't quite a song but was moving toward one. She thought about Rose's voice, the way she'd described her mother's humming. Not real songs, just sounds, like she was making up a song while she did it. She sat there in the kitchen while the morning came in and let herself feel all of it. The fear that was finally releasing its grip, the exhaustion, and underneath both of those, something quieter. Something that felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that train in Dry Creek with her single bag and her planning face, and her three possibilities that had turned to nothing in the space of an afternoon, like belonging. Not belonging to anyone. Not yet. Maybe not in that way at all. But belonging somewhere. Belonging to this house, to these children, to the particular difficult human problem of a family trying to find its way back to itself after catastrophic loss. She was part of that problem now. She was part of the solution to it. She was not the woman three men had turned away on a public street. She was not the punchline of Thomas Greer's loud-voiced joke. She was not suited or not fitting or any of those careful phrases that meant we looked at you and decided you weren't worth the effort. She was the woman who had sat up all night in a chair and kept an 8-year-old girl in this world. That was who she was. It had always been who she was. It had just taken a frontier fever and a night that went on forever for the right people to see it. She finished her cold coffee and put the cup in the wash basin and went to her room and lay down in her clothes and was asleep within 60 seconds, with the morning coming through the west-facing window and the sound of the ranch settling into its day outside, ordinary and alive. She slept until noon and woke up feeling like she'd been wrung out and hung on a fence to dry. That was the unglamorous truth of it. No gentle waking, no peaceful morning clarity. She came back to consciousness with a jolt, disoriented for 3 seconds, and then the previous 24 hours landed on her all at once. The fever, the compresses. Rose's breathing changing at 1 in the morning, the dawn light coming in when the fever finally broke. She lay there for a moment and let it settle, and then she got up because lying there wasn't something she was built for. Rose was asleep when she checked, and Silas was in the chair beside the bed, also asleep, his chin dropped toward his chest and his arms folded in that particular way of a man who'd meant to stay awake and lost the argument. Caleb was in his own room, finally, his door ajar. She could hear him breathing from the hallway. She went downstairs and made soup because that was what you did after a fever. You made something plain and warm that could be taken in small amounts, something that said we're moving forward now without making too many demands on a body that had just been through a fight. Dr. Hennessy came back that afternoon to check on Rose. He was a man of few wasted movements, physically or verbally, and he looked the girl over, asked her a series of questions she answered in a voice still thin from the night, and then declared her on the right side of it with the brisk satisfaction of someone who'd learned not to celebrate too loudly until things were actually settled. Before he left, he found Evelyn in the kitchen. "You kept good notes on her through the night," he said. He meant the log she'd kept on a piece of paper. Time, temperature estimate by feel, what she'd administered, how the breathing sounded. She hadn't known if anyone would read it. She'd done it because her mother's doctor had told her once that a record was the difference between guessing and knowing. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I didn't learn it anywhere formal," she said. "I learned it because I needed to." He looked at her with the direct appraisal of a man who spent his professional life reading people's bodies for information. "You've got a knack for this," he said. "More than a knack." She didn't know what to do with that, so she thanked him and walked him to the door. Word that Rose Rowan had nearly died of fever and had been pulled through by the woman staying at the ranch, moved through Dry Creek the way all information moved through small frontier towns, fast, imprecise, and expanding with every telling. By the time it reached the far end of the main street, the fever had apparently been so severe that the doctor himself had said there was no hope, and Evelyn Hart had worked some manner of miracle through the night. She didn't hear this version firsthand. She heard it from Silas, who had gone into town 4 days after Rose's fever broke to collect supplies, and came back with a look on his face that was somewhere between amused and unsettled. "Margaret Holt stopped me outside the feed store," he said, setting a sack of flour on the counter. "She wants to know if you'd be willing to come speak to some of the women in town. About fevers, about managing illness at home, about—" He paused. "I'm quoting her now. What you know that the rest of us don't." Evelyn kept kneading the bread she was working on. "Margaret Holt thinks I'm keeping secrets?" "Margaret Holt thinks you're remarkable," he said, which for her is practically a religious conversion, since 2 months ago she was telling anyone who'd listen that you were a scandal. 3 months ago, Rose corrected from the table, where she was sitting up for the first time. Properly sitting, not propped, and doing the string figures she'd been teaching Evelyn. She looked better, still thin, still moving carefully, but the clarity was back in her eyes and her voice had come back to its normal quiet register. Silas looked at his daughter. Something in his face did what it always did when he looked at her now. Relaxed and tightened at the same time. Like a man who'd been handed back something he'd thought was gone and was still adjusting to the weight of having it. 3 months ago, he agreed. Evelyn turned the bread. "Tell Mrs. Holt I'll come Thursday," she said. "But I'm not speaking to a group. If women want to talk, they can come individually, and we'll talk." Silas raised an eyebrow. That's not what she was picturing. "I know, but a group becomes a performance, and a performance isn't useful. One woman telling another woman what she knows. That's useful." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll tell her." Thursday came and went, and then the Thursday after that, and somewhere in the space of those 2 weeks, the arrangement shifted into something neither of them had quite defined. Women came to the ranch quietly, at first, 1 or 2 at a time, then more. A widow named Estelle who'd been managing her homestead alone since her husband broke his leg and never healed right. A young wife named Dora who was pregnant with her 3rd child and trying to hide how frightened she was. An older woman named Pat, whose name was actually Patricia, but who'd been called Pat since childhood and intended to stay that way, who had a daughter with a cough that had been going on too long. Evelyn talked to them. Listened, mostly. Told them what she knew about fevers and about stretching provisions, and about the particular endurance required to run a household when everything was against you. She didn't present it as wisdom. She presented it as information she happened to have, which was how her mother had always shared knowledge, as if it were a practical tool being passed from one person's hand to another. What she didn't expect was what they gave her in return. Estelle showed her a way to preserve meat that lasted longer than anything Evelyn had tried in the ranch's larder. Dora, who was more capable than her frightened eyes suggested, told her about a source for seed that was cheaper than what the general store carried. Pat, who was sharp as a tack under her quiet exterior, told her things about Dry Creek's history, its people, the currents that ran under the surface of the town that Evelyn had been navigating blind. Thomas Greer, Pat said one afternoon, matter-of-factly, while they were sitting with coffee at the kitchen table, has been telling people he let you go because he saw right away you were too good for what he needed. Evelyn stared at her. He told people he rejected me, publicly, in the middle of the street. He did, Pat agreed. Now he's been rethinking the narrative. She drank her coffee. He asked around about you, before the fever, after, more after. Asked what? Whether you were serious about staying at the ranch. Whether you and Silas Rowan had an, Pat paused delicately, understanding. Evelyn set her cup down. We have a professional arrangement, she said. Pat's expression was the expression of a woman who had been listening to people describe their situations for 60-odd years and had developed a fine sensitivity to the distance between what was said and what was true. She didn't comment on it. She just nodded and changed the subject, which was somehow more pointed than if she'd said something. It was Caleb who told her first, which was not how she'd expected it to go. Caleb, who had spent the first weeks of her time at the ranch conducting a low-grade campaign of resistance, who had never fully crossed the line into outright cruelty, but had kept her at a precise and deliberate distance, had been different since the fever. Not transformed, not suddenly warm, but different in the specific way that a person is different when they've watched someone show up for the things that count and have had to revise their assessment. He came to her one evening when Silas was out checking on the cattle with one of his hired hands, and Rose was in the sitting room with her book. He came into the kitchen, which was unusual because he generally avoided rooms where she was working alone, and he stood at the counter like he was inspecting something. Mr. Greer came by the fence today when I was in the east field, he said. Evelyn kept doing what she was doing, which was sorting through the dried herbs she'd been collecting. What did he want? He asked me if Miss Hart was still staying here. Caleb picked up a dried sprig of something and put it back down. I said yes. All right. He said to tell you he'd like to call on you. She stopped sorting, looked at Caleb. He was looking at the herbs with the elaborate casualness of a boy who was paying very close attention to her reaction. And what did you say? She asked. I said I'd pass the message along. He paused. I didn't say anything else. But you're telling me with a particular face, she said. He looked up. His eyes were very like his father's, dark, direct, not given to evasion. I don't think you should, he said. See him, I mean. He was mean to you, right in front of everybody. She looked at him for a moment. You know about that? Everybody knows. People in town still talk about it. He said it plainly, without melodrama, the way children sometimes state the hardest things. He pointed at you like you were... He stopped. He wasn't kind. No, she said. He wasn't. So why would you want to talk to him now? Just because he changed his mind? She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. I probably won't see him, she said. But the reason isn't what he did to me in that street. The reason is that I'm not interested in what he's decided I'm worth now that things are different. She paused. People who only see your value after someone else does first aren't seeing you. They're following a current.
Caleb thought about this. Like how the cattle always go where the other cattle went. She almost smiled. Exactly like that. He nodded slowly, satisfied. Then he went back to looking at the herbs. Rose is reading that same chapter again, he said. She's read it 4 times. She says she's not, but she has. What chapter? The one with the mother in it. He said it very carefully, without drama, and then he walked out of the kitchen. She stood there for a moment after he left and felt the particular ache of something she wasn't going to name out loud, something that lived in the territory between what a job was and what a home was. Thomas Greer came to the ranch on a Saturday, which she hadn't invited him to do, and which told her something about the nature of his confidence. He appeared in the afternoon when Silas was gone, and Caleb and Rose were out behind the barn doing something she could hear but not see. He came up the front path with his jacket on, which on a warm Saturday afternoon meant he'd made an effort, which meant he'd thought about this. She met him on the porch. He looked better than she remembered, which was an irrelevant observation, and she noted it and set it aside. He had the bearing of a man who was comfortable in most situations and had decided this one would be no exception, which told her he hadn't fully understood what he was walking into. "Miss Hart," he said, with a smile that was practiced but not insincere, "you're looking well." "Mr. Greer," she said, "I didn't know you were coming." "I sent word through—" He paused. "The boy. I thought perhaps he'd mentioned it." "He mentioned it," she said. Something in her tone told him enough to make the smile shift slightly. "May I sit?" "I'd rather you just say what you came to say," she said. "I've got a lot of afternoon left and things to do in it." He looked at her steadily. Recalibrating, she could see it. He'd come out here with a version of this conversation prepared, and she'd just moved the furniture around. "All right," he said. "I'll be direct. I made a mistake. The way I handled things when you arrived, that wasn't— I behaved badly. Publicly." He said it like a man who found the admission uncomfortable but not impossible. "I've been hearing about you since, about what you did during the Rowan girls' fever, about what you've been doing for people in town. And that's changed your mind," she said. "It's helped me see more clearly." "More clearly than you saw me on the day I arrived," she said, "when you'd exchanged letters with me for 3 months." He was quiet for a beat. "I made a judgment I shouldn't have." "You made a judgment," she said. "You're right about that. You looked at me standing on that street after 3 days of travel and decided in about 4 minutes that I wasn't what you wanted. Then you made it a public announcement." She kept her voice level. Not angry, just accurate. "Now you're here because Dr. Hennessy told someone who told someone that I kept an 8-year-old girl alive through the night, and that's changed the picture." "You're being unkind," he said, and there was an edge in his voice now. "I'm being honest," she said. "There's a difference, though I understand they can feel the same." He stood there for a moment. Then something in his posture shifted, the practiced ease going down a degree or two to something more real under it. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "There's nothing to say. I don't hold a grudge against you, Mr. Greer. What you did hurt, and it was unnecessary, and I've moved past it." She looked at him directly. "But I'm not interested in being reconsidered. You had the full information, 3 months of letters. You made your choice. This," she gestured, meaning him, the jacket, the Saturday afternoon, "is not about me. It's about your revised opinion of what I might be worth, and I don't have any use for that." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding whether to push further and then deciding not to, which was at least a kind of intelligence. "You're sure?" he said. "Very." He nodded, reached up and touched the brim of his hat, old reflex. "Good afternoon, Miss Hart." "Good afternoon," she said. She watched him walk back down the path, felt nothing in particular about it, no triumph, no residual anger, no satisfaction beyond the simple, clean feeling of having said exactly what she meant. She went back inside. Silas was in the barn when she found him, working on something with a harness that had a buckle worn through. He heard her come in but kept working. "Greer came by," she said. He kept his eyes on the harness. "I know." She stopped. "How do you know?" "Caleb told me when I got back. Described it too." He paused. "In some detail." "Caleb wasn't watching." "Caleb is always watching," Silas said. "You know that by now."
She did, actually. He was here to ask me to, I don't know exactly what he was asking, to give him a second consideration, I suppose. Silas set the harness down, turned to look at her. His expression was careful in a way that was different from his usual careful, not closed off, but deliberate, like a man making sure of something before he speaks. And, he said, and I said no. He nodded, looked back at the harness. Good, he said, and the word came out with a flatness that might have been neutrality and might have been something else entirely. She stood in the barn doorway and felt the afternoon light at her back and the smell of hay and horse and worked leather, and something shifted in the air between them, the way it had shifted in the kitchen the morning after the fever, the way it had been shifting in increments for weeks now, the way that things shift when two people spend enough time in the same difficult space and stop pretending they don't notice each other. Silas, she said. Evelyn, he said to the harness, look at me. He looked up. His eyes had that thing in them she'd seen before, the watching, the caution, the awareness of something large that he hadn't decided what to do with. I'm not going anywhere, she said, not as a promise about Greer, as something larger. He held her gaze, the muscle in his jaw moved. I know, he said. Then, quieter. I know that now. She nodded and left him to the harness. The shift in Dry Creek happened slowly, and then all at once, the way most things do. It started with the women who came to the ranch. They went back to town and talked to their husbands, their neighbors, their friends. The way women in small communities carry information that reshapes how a place understands itself. What they said was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no formal changes of position. It was more like a tide, the slow movement of a dozen small conversations about the woman at the Rowan Ranch, what she knew, what she'd done, what she continued to do, until the current of opinion simply moved. Margaret Holt was the most visible marker of it. Evelyn encountered her in the general store one Wednesday morning, and Margaret, who had been the engine of the town's judgment those first weeks, looked at her with an expression that was not exactly warm, but was fundamentally different from what it had been. Estelle Marsh says you helped her work out the drainage problem in her south cellar, Margaret said. We talked about it, Evelyn said. She worked it out herself. She says you did. She's being generous. Margaret was quiet for a moment, rearranging some fabric bolts in a way that suggested she was thinking and using her hands to cover it. I want to apologize to you, she said finally, for what I said when you first came. The things I said to your face and the things I said when I thought you couldn't hear. Evelyn looked at her. Margaret Holt was a woman of 60, with strong opinions and the history to back most of them, and this admission had clearly cost her something. Evelyn wasn't going to make it cost more than it needed to. I appreciate that, she said simply. Let's move forward from here. Margaret looked almost relieved, like she'd been carrying it. The other thing that happened, less comfortable, more complicated, was Caleb's school situation. He'd been missing the school in town intermittently, because getting him there and back on days when Silas was out early was difficult and the arrangement had never been quite settled. Evelyn had been teaching him at the ranch on the days he couldn't go, which had started as practicality and had turned into something more deliberate, because Caleb had a mind that moved fast and got bored and then made trouble when it was bored, and she knew that particular combination from her own childhood. One afternoon, she caught him doing his numbers wrong on purpose, not making mistakes, but making specific strategic mistakes designed to finish the work faster. Do it again, she said. Correctly. He looked up with an expression of pure calculation. I got it close enough. Close enough is for horseshoes, she said. Do it again. You sound like a school teacher. I'm going to be your school teacher until I'm not, so you might as well adjust. He did it again, got it right. Then, were you a school teacher in St. Louis? No, I worked in a store. Then how do you know so much? She looked at him. I read, she said. Constantly. Everything I could get my hands on. Books, newspapers, almanacs, anything. She paused. What's in your head is the only thing that belongs entirely to you. Nobody can take it. Doesn't matter where you are or what happens. What you know stays. He was quiet with this for a moment. Papa doesn't read much, he said. He says he never had time.
Your father is one of the most practically intelligent people I've met, she said. He just applied it differently. Caleb considered this. Can you teach me more than the school does? In some things, she said. In some things, the school will do better. You need both. Is that an answer? Yes, she said. That's an answer. He went back to his numbers. She went back to what she'd been doing, which was drafting a careful list of what the ranch needed before winter. Supplies, repairs, things she'd noticed over the months adding up in the margins of running the house. She wrote in small, precise handwriting because she'd learned early to waste nothing, including paper. She felt Silas in the doorway before she heard him. She'd developed that, an awareness of him in a room, the particular quality of his presence, which was quiet but never absent. She'd stopped pretending she didn't have it. How long have you been standing there? She asked without looking up. Long enough, he said. She kept writing. Long enough for what? To hear you tell my son that what's in your head is the only thing that belongs entirely to you. A pause. That's something Clara used to say. She looked up then. He was in the doorway, not quite inside, in that way he had of approaching things at an angle. His expression was open in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. Not wide open, not without reservation, but the doors were no longer entirely shut. I didn't know that, she said. I know you didn't. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, which he was doing more now. Just sitting, not because there was a reason, because he could. I've been wanting to tell you something, he said. Caleb, without being told to, gathered his papers and went to the other room. She heard his footsteps on the floor and felt, briefly, the specific fondness for a child who had learned when to give adults their space. Silas looked at his hands, then at her. When I wrote that note and put it under your door, I didn't think you'd stay more than 2 weeks. I want to be honest about that. I needed someone, and I thought you needed somewhere, and I figured we'd see. He paused. I was wrong about a lot of things. About what you do with the place, what you do with the kids. He stopped again. About what I'd... He looked away, looked back. About how much it would matter. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas, she said carefully. I'm not saying it's simple, he said. I know what this looks like from the outside. I know the town already has opinions about it. I know you came here under one set of circumstances, and I changed them on you without asking, and... He stopped himself. I don't want you to feel like you have to... Stop, she said. Not harshly, just to stop the sentence before it went somewhere too careful. You're talking yourself into a corner. He looked at her. I'm trying not to make assumptions. Then let me be clear, she said. I stayed because I wanted to stay, not because I had nowhere else, not because it was convenient, because this house and these children and... She stopped herself in exactly the way he'd stopped himself a moment before, for exactly the same reason. Because this matters to me. What happens here matters. He watched her. That watchfulness that had frustrated her in the early weeks, which she understood now was not coldness, but a man being careful with things he'd already lost once. Evelyn, he said, and the way he said it this time was different from every other time, not testing the weight, but knowing it. I'd like to... I don't know exactly how to... He exhaled, tried again. I'd like things to be different between us than they are now, if that's something you'd want. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass the way it did out here, with a particular sound that she'd learned was specific to this land. Rose called something to Caleb from the yard. A horse moved in the barn. She looked at Silas Rowan, at the tired eyes that had more light in them now than they'd had in September, at the jaw that was still set with the habit of a man who'd learned to hold himself together, at the hands on the table that had ridden 8 hours through the dark to bring a doctor back to his daughter. Yes, she said, that's something I'd want. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't move at all, actually. He just looked at her with something releasing in his face, something long held letting go, and she felt it the way you feel a change in weather. Not dramatic, not sudden, just real. All right, he said, simply, like something had been decided. All right, she agreed. Outside, Rose laughed at something Caleb had said or done, the clear, high sound of it coming through the window. Real laughter, easy laughter, the kind that had been missing from this yard for a year and a half. Both of them heard it. Both of them felt it.
Silas looked toward the window, then back at her. The thing in his face was not what she would call happiness exactly. It was more complicated than that, layered over too much loss to be simple. But it was close to it. As close, she thought, as a man like him was going to get to it for a while, and that was enough to work with. She turned back to her list. He stayed at the table. After a moment, he reached over and picked up the pencil she wasn't using and began sketching out what he thought the repairs on the east fence were going to cost. And she looked at his numbers and saw immediately that he was underestimating the post cost and told him so, and they argued about it mildly for 10 minutes while the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor and the children played outside, and the house did what it had been slowly learning to do again. It held them all. The fence cost argument turned out to be the first of many. Not arguments exactly, more like the ongoing negotiation of two people who both had opinions and had stopped pretending otherwise. She said the east pasture posts would run higher than he'd penciled. He said he had a supplier in Mill Haven who could do it cheaper. She said then he should have written that down instead of pulling a number from the air. He said the number wasn't from the air, it was from experience. She said experience and current prices were two different things, and he should write to Mill Haven and confirm before they committed the budget. He wrote to Mill Haven. She was right by 40 cents per post. He told her she was right in approximately the same tone he might have used to report a weather change, flat, factual, completely without performance. And she found that she liked that about him. The men she'd known growing up, and the three she'd come out here to consider, had all had some version of a relationship with being wrong that involved elaborate navigation. Silas just said she was right and moved on to the next thing, and there was something in that directness that felt, after a lifetime of managing around other people's discomfort, like fresh air. November came in cold and fast. The land around the ranch went from gold to brown to a kind of gray that was not bleak exactly, but serious. The frontier's version of a warning that winter was not a suggestion out here, it was a reckoning. Evelyn had grown up with Missouri winters, which were their own kind of hard, but this was different. This was the cold that came off open land with nothing to slow it down, that got into the walls of a house through every gap and crack, and made you understand viscerally why the women who'd been out here longer kept such meticulous stores. She threw herself into the preparations with the specific intensity of someone who'd been caught underprepared before and had no intention of being caught again. She reworked the larder system she'd built over the summer, taking Estelle's preservation method and combining it with things she'd worked out herself through trial and several failures she'd rather not dwell on. She made Caleb help her check every window seal in the house, which he did with his usual commentary and his increasingly rare but increasingly genuine flashes of humor. "This one's basically just open," he said, standing at the window in the spare room, the room that had been hers when she first arrived and had since shifted without any formal discussion into a kind of storage and study space. She'd moved her things to the room adjacent to the children's rooms sometime in September, when it had become clear that the spare room's western exposure made it miserable in the cold, and the other room was warmer. Nobody had made a production of this. Things just settled. "Pack it," she told him. "Use the rags in the box on the lower shelf. There's a lot of them. Then you'll have plenty to work with." He packed the window, badly at first, and then better when she showed him the technique, not stuffing randomly, but working from the bottom up, making sure the gaps were actually filled. He stood back and looked at his work. "That'll hold?" he asked. "Better than it was," she said. "Perfect is the enemy of done." He looked at her sideways. "You say things like that a lot." "My mother said them first." "What was she like?" She looked at him, slightly surprised. He'd never asked about her before, not directly, not about her life before Dry Creek. He was looking at the window he'd just packed, which was his way of asking something while giving her the option of not noticing. "Stubborn," she said, "but practical, funnier than she thought she was." She paused. She didn't have an easy life, but she wasn't beaten down by it. She just got through things. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Like you," he said. She didn't know how to respond to that without making it too large, so she just said, "The next window's in the hall," and handed him the box of rags. He took it and went, and she stood in the spare room for a moment and felt the thing she couldn't quite name, this accumulation of small moments that had been adding up since September, this sense of being known, gradually and imperfectly, by people who hadn't chosen her initially but had come around to her through the simple fact of daily life. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It never was the life you planned. But it was real in a way that the planned life probably wouldn't have been, because planned lives had a way of being slightly too comfortable, slightly too confirmed, slightly too much like what you already knew about yourself. This was not that. This was harder and stranger and more uncertain than anything she'd mapped out in her St. Louis apartment, answering letters in careful handwriting and imagining a future that turned out to be nothing like the actual one. She was, on balance, glad. Silas asked her to marry him on a Wednesday evening in late November, which was not a romantic setting by any external measure. They were in the kitchen. She was mending one of Rose's dresses, which had caught on something and torn along the side seam. He was at the table with the ranch accounts, which he'd started doing at the kitchen table instead of in the small office off the barn sometime around October. And she had developed the theory that this was not about the accounting. He put his pencil down. She kept mending. "Evelyn," he said. I want to ask you something." "All right. Look at me first." She looked up. He had the expression he got when he'd been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided that the thinking wasn't going to get any more useful, a kind of deliberate resolve that sat over whatever he was actually feeling, which was, she had learned, considerably more complicated than he usually let on. "I know this is not how any of this was supposed to go," he said. "For you. You came here for one thing and ended up somewhere completely different, and the arrangement I offered you was never fair, and I know that." "Silas," she said, "if you're about to apologize as a preamble to something, I'd rather you skip to the something." His mouth did the thing that was almost but not quite a smile. "Marry me," he said, then immediately, "I'm asking, not telling. I want to be clear about that." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her. I don't have a speech. I've been trying to think of one for about 3 weeks, and everything I came up with sounded either like I was settling accounts or like something out of a church pamphlet, and neither of those is Silas. Yes, she said. He stopped. "Yes, the speech is wrong," or "Yes, I'll marry you." He went very still for a moment, the way he did when something had happened that he needed to confirm was real. Then he exhaled slowly. "Right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. There was no dramatic gesture. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the hand that was holding the half-mended dress, and left it there for a moment, and she turned her hand over and held his, and that was the proposal. That was the whole of it. It was enough. More than enough. The children's reactions were, predictably, not identical. Rose, when Silas told them the next morning, looked at Evelyn for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes that had been watching her since September. Then she asked, "Are we going to stay here on the ranch?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "And you're going to stay?" "Yes." Rose nodded. Something settled in her face, not surprise, something more like confirmation of a thing she'd already suspected, and had been holding carefully in case it turned out to be wrong. She slid off her chair and came around the table and put her arms around Evelyn's waist with the quiet deliberateness of a child who'd decided something. Evelyn held her and looked over her head at Silas, who was watching with his jaw set against something he wasn't going to show in front of the children. Caleb, who was sitting across from where his sister had been, had his arms crossed. "I knew," he said. "Did you?" Silas said. "Weeks ago." He looked at his father. "You're not subtle, Papa." "I thought I was." "You weren't." He looked at Evelyn. "Are you going to change things? In the house?" "I've been changing things in the house since September," she pointed out. "I mean big things." "What's a big thing to you?" He thought about it. "My room," he said, "and the barn, and supper at 6, not 5. "Your room is your room," she said. "The barn is your father's. Supper at 6 is already what we do." She paused. "Is that the whole list?" He uncrossed his arms. Not all the way. Partially. Which, for Caleb, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "It's the important things," he said. "Then we're settled," she said. He picked up his fork and went back to breakfast, and she understood, because she'd learned how to read him over these months, that this was his version of acceptance. Caleb didn't throw open doors. He just stopped holding them shut. That was enough. That was who he was. The wedding happened in December, on a Saturday that was cold but clear, with the particular hard blue sky that the frontier produced in winter, like a kind of compensation for everything else the season took. They kept it small because neither of them wanted a production. Judge Alcott from Millhaven came out and performed the ceremony in the front room of the ranch house, which was the cleanest and most presentable room but still had a crack in the ceiling plaster that Evelyn had been meaning to get to and hadn't. She noticed the crack during the ceremony and made a mental note and then made herself stop making mental notes and be present. Pat was there, the only person from town they'd specifically invited. Estelle came, and Dora, who had her new baby by then, a girl, healthy, whose arrival Evelyn had helped Dora prepare for over the course of the fall. The two hired hands who worked the ranch, Amos and a younger man named Fletcher, who hadn't been there long enough to have strong opinions about anything yet, stood in the doorway because the room only held so many people. She wore the second dress, the clean one. She'd bought a new collar for it in town, white cotton, simple, because she didn't have the money or the inclination for anything more than that, and she looked at herself in the small mirror in her room before she came out and thought, "This is who I am." Not the woman who arrived on that train with 3 prospects and nothing else. Not the woman Thomas Greer pointed at on the main street. This. A woman who had done something real with a hard situation and was now walking into the front room of the house she'd spent 3 months putting back together, to marry the man who'd slid a note under a hotel room door because he was out of options and honest enough to say so. She could work with honest. She had always been able to work with honest. Silas was in the front room when she came in, and he looked at her in the way that was different from looking. The way she'd learned was his version of everything he didn't say out loud, which in his case was considerable. He'd put on his good jacket. He'd gotten his hair cut in town earlier in the week, which Caleb had commented on at length. They stood in front of Judge Alcott, and Rose stood beside Evelyn and Caleb stood beside his father. And the judge read the words that made the thing legal and real. And Evelyn said the things she was supposed to say in a voice that was steady because she felt steady, which was different from the kind of steady she'd performed on that street in September with Thomas Greer's voice echoing off the storefronts. That steadiness had been the kind you manufacture under pressure. This was the kind that comes from being in the right place. Silas put the ring on her finger. A plain band, nothing elaborate, which she had specifically requested and he had specifically understood without needing explanation. When it was done and Judge Alcott said what he said, Silas looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a moment, and then he kissed her in the way of a man who'd been waiting for months for the moment to be the right one. And she thought, yes, this is the one. Pat cried. Rose held Evelyn's hand with both of her small ones. Caleb looked at the ceiling with the expression of a boy who had feelings about this and was not going to display them in front of witnesses, which was so purely him that she almost laughed. After, they ate. It was food she'd made, with help from Estelle and Dora, and it was good without being extraordinary, which was exactly what she'd wanted. You didn't need extraordinary. You needed enough and real and made with attention, and that was what they had. Winter settled in fully after that. They moved through the cold months the way frontier people did, by staying close and staying busy and not catastrophizing over the things they couldn't control, which was most things. The ranch required constant maintenance against the cold, and Silas and Amos worked the cattle in the mornings while Fletcher handled the closer-in work, and Evelyn ran the house and taught the children and did the 100 small things that kept a household functional when the weather outside was an argument against existing at all. She and Silas developed the specific language of a shared life, not a romantic language, something more practical and more durable. The shorthand of 2 people who'd learned each other's habits and had decided the habits were livable. He knew she needed quiet in the first hour of the morning before the rest of the house woke up, and he made sure she got it. She knew he processed difficult things by going out to the barn and doing something physical until the difficulty had settled, and she stopped treating this as withdrawal. They disagreed regularly about money, because she was more conservative and he was more willing to take risk, which turned out to be a useful combination when they stopped fighting about it and started using it. It was not a perfect arrangement. There was no such thing, and she didn't trust people who claimed otherwise. He was difficult sometimes. He went quiet in ways that felt closed off rather than thoughtful, and she had to learn the difference, which took longer than she'd wanted. He carried Clara's loss in a way that didn't diminish but also didn't disappear, and there were moments, fewer as the months passed, but present, when she'd find him somewhere in the house with that look, the one that was looking at something that wasn't there, and she'd learned to leave those moments alone and let him come back on his own. It would have been easier if she could help him through it, but some things weren't helped through. They were just survived in the company of someone who knew not to make you explain yourself. She was difficult too, and honest enough to know it. She didn't soften edges that didn't need softening. She had opinions about how things should be done that were not always open for revision. She missed St. Louis occasionally. Not the life she'd had there, but the city itself, the sound of it, the way a city existed regardless of you and you existed in it. And those were two separate things, which was a kind of privacy she'd undervalued until it was gone. She told Silas this one evening, not expecting anything from it, just saying it. He looked at her. What do you miss specifically? She thought about it. The bookstore on Merchant Street. It had a cat that lived in the front window. I used to walk past it in the evenings on my way home. He was quiet for a moment. Then, write down the names of books you want. I'll order them when I go to Mill Haven. It wasn't the same. She didn't pretend it was. She wrote down the list anyway, and he ordered the books, and they arrived in the spring, slightly battered from the journey, and she put them on the shelf in the front room and felt something settle that had been unsettled without her quite noticing it was. That was marriage, she thought, not the ceremony and not the feeling in the moment, and not even the big acts of courage or survival that made for better stories. It was the list of books and the ordered copies arriving dented and the shelf in the front room. It was the specific shape of someone knowing what you needed and deciding it mattered. Spring arrived, and with it, the particular energy of a frontier after winter, everything that had been frozen or dormant or held back coming loose at once, insistent, almost aggressive. The garden she'd started working on in the fall and abandoned to the cold came back to her in March, and she threw herself into it with the accumulated frustration of someone who'd been indoors too long. Rose gardened with her. This had started the previous summer tentatively and had become by spring a genuine collaboration. The two of them in the dirt together, Rose asking questions and listening to the answers with the focused attention she applied to everything she actually cared about. She had her mother's hands, Silas had mentioned once, small and quick. She had his eyes. What was hers alone, built in the space of her particular 8 years of living, was a kind of philosophical seriousness that expressed itself in questions that made you stop and think before you answered. If a plant grows back after winter, Rose said one morning in April, pulling dead material from around a row of what would eventually be beans, is it the same plant or a different one? Depends on this plant, Evelyn said. Some things die back to the root and grow from there, so technically, same root, new growth. But it's new. The roots are the same. Rose thought about this for a moment, her small hands working steadily. I think people are like that, she said. After something bad, the roots are the same, but what grows is new. Evelyn looked at her. At 8.5, Rose Rowan had the eyes of someone older, and the particular seriousness of a child who'd had to grow up faster than was entirely fair and had done it anyway. I think you're right, Evelyn said. Are you like that? Rose asked. From before you came here? She sat back on her heels and considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I think so, she said. The things that were mine, the way I think, what I know, what I care about, those didn't change. But what I'm doing with them is completely different from what I thought I'd be doing. Is it better? She looked at the garden. At the ranch beyond it, the house she'd spent months putting back together, the south field where the blackberry bushes were starting to show their early green. She thought about the hotel room with the cracked basin, about Thomas Greer's voice carrying across the street, about the note slipped under her door by a man who was honest enough to say exactly what he was offering and what he wasn't. Yes, she said. It's better. Rose nodded, satisfied, and went back to pulling dead material. Evelyn went back to her own row, and they worked together in the morning quiet with the kind of ease that doesn't announce itself but is unmistakable. Two people who have found their rhythm and are moving inside it. Caleb's transformation, such as it was, happened in a way that was very like him, quietly, off to the side in a direction she hadn't expected. He started teaching Rose things. Not because anyone asked him to, he just began, sometime in the late winter, showing his sister things he'd learned from Evelyn over the months. The mending technique, the window packing, how to check if a jar was properly sealed. He did it with the brisk, unsentimental manner of an older sibling who has decided that teaching is not an emotional act but a practical one, and Rose received it the same way. And Evelyn watched this happening from across rooms without making any comment about it, because the moment you made a comment was the moment it became self-conscious. But she told Silas about it one evening, just mentioned it. He was quiet for a moment. "He's taking care of her," he said. "Yes." "He used to do that before." He paused. "After Clara." He stopped. "I don't think he thought he could." "He thinks he can now," she said. Silas looked at her directly. "Because of you." "Because he's Caleb," she said. "He was always going to get there. He just needed time and somewhere safe to go through it." "Evelyn," he said, "don't do that." "Do what?" "Minimize what you've given this family." His voice had the particular flatness that meant he was saying something he'd been sitting on. "I've watched you do it with the town too. People tell you what you've done, and you find a way to give the credit somewhere else. I understand why. But you don't have to do that here. Not with me." She looked at him. He was not wrong. She knew he was not wrong. The habit of deflection was old and deep. The habit of a woman who'd learned early that claiming too much made people uncomfortable and made you a target. And she'd carried it so long she sometimes didn't notice it operating. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The fire in the front room needed banking, and she got up to do it, and he watched her, and the room was quiet and warm, and outside the winter was finally losing its argument with the land. By summer, things in Dry Creek had shifted enough that she could feel the difference as texture rather than just incident. Margaret Holt, who had become an unexpected ally, organized a gathering at the church hall. Not a church gathering, just the building, which was the largest enclosed space in town, to address the issue of medical knowledge among the women of the area. She asked Evelyn to lead it. Evelyn said she'd participate, not lead, because she wasn't an authority. She was someone who'd accumulated specific information that happened to be useful, and those were different things. The gathering happened on a Thursday in July, and more women came than either of them expected. Women from ranches and homesteads 20 miles out, who'd heard through the specific information network of the frontier that there was something worth making the trip for. Evelyn talked about fevers, about wound care, about the signs that meant you had time and the signs that meant you needed to move fast. She talked about record keeping, about what to put in a home kit and why, about the difference between what a doctor could do and what you could do in the hours before a doctor was reachable. She talked about her mother. Not at length and not with sentiment, but she talked about her, about what 4 years of necessary care had taught her, about the way that knowledge was passed between women not in books, but in the space between one person's experience and another's need. When she was done, a woman she didn't know, from a ranch north of town, raised her hand and asked, "How did you know you weren't going to make a mistake?" Evelyn looked at her. "I didn't," she said. "I just knew that doing nothing was a worse mistake than trying." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Nah. She was walking back from the church hall that evening. Silas had come into town for supplies and would meet her at the wagon when she passed the spot in the main street where Thomas Greer had stood and pointed at her almost a year ago. She stopped for a moment, looked at the spot. It was ordinary. A patch of dirt road like any other patch of dirt road, and the building he'd come out of now had a new sign because it had changed hands in the spring. Nothing marked what had happened there. That was the nature of public humiliations. They felt permanent and weren't. She stood there for a moment and let herself feel whatever there was left to feel about it, which turned out to be less than she expected. Not nothing. She'd be lying to say nothing. The memory of standing there with her bag and her 3 days of travel on her and Greer's voice carrying across the street, that had not vanished. It had just reduced itself to something accurate, a thing that had happened, not the whole story, not even a central chapter of it. Just a page early on that had turned out to be load-bearing in ways she hadn't understood at the time. Because without it, she'd have been on that train back to St. Louis with nothing, instead of standing in the main street of Dry Creek with a life that was unrecognizable to the woman she'd been when she arrived. She didn't feel grateful to Thomas Greer. That would have been too tidy. But she didn't feel the wound of it in the way she'd expected to still feel it. She heard the wagon behind her and turned. Silas pulled up and looked at her. Looked at the spot she'd been standing in. He knew the story well enough by now to put it together. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it. She climbed up onto the wagon bench beside him. He handed her the reins while he dealt with something in the back, which was his way of including her without making a point of it. She took them. The horse waited with the patience of an animal that had made this road many times. When he was settled beside her, he didn't take the reins back. She kept them. "How did it go?" he asked, meaning the gathering. "Good," she said. "Better than I expected. There's a woman from north of town, Harper, I think her name is, who has more practical knowledge than I do about certain things. I want to have her back." "You're building something," he said. "I'm passing things along," she said. "That's different." Evelyn. "What?" "Don't minimize," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with the particular focus of a man who was saying something sideways, which was his method when what he was saying mattered more than it looked. She looked back at the road too. The ranch was 3 miles out, and the evening light was doing what it did out here in summer, turning everything gold in a way that was almost aggressive, the land insisting on its own beauty regardless of whatever the people living on it thought about it. "All right," she said, "I'm building something." "Yes," he said, "you are." They rode home in the easy quiet that had become theirs, the particular silence of two people who'd stopped needing to fill every space and had started trusting what lived in the quiet instead. The ranch came into view at the bottom of a long, slow rise, and she saw it the way she sometimes still did. The house, the barn, the garden that was genuinely producing now, the south fence that had been repaired properly in April. It looked like a place that was being attended to, a place where someone had decided the effort was worth it. Rose was visible in the garden, small figure in the evening light, crouched over something, probably checking the beans. Caleb would be in the barn or pretending to help Amos with something while actually directing operations, which was his consistent approach. The smoke from the kitchen stove was thin and straight in the still air. It was not dramatic. It was not the life she'd written careful letters imagining. It was harder than that and more specific than that, and threaded through with loss that had been borne by the people in it long before she arrived. It had room for grief in it, and room for argument, and room for the particular difficulty of two people learning each other's worst habits and deciding the whole package was worth it. It had, she thought, the particular quality of real things, uneven and complicated and not always beautiful and utterly, stubbornly alive. She thought about the woman who had sat in a hotel room with a cracked basin and read a note 3 times looking for the trap, who had shown up in a barn kitchen with a planning face and not enough money and a determination that had no particular basis in the available evidence at the time. She thought about what she would tell that woman now, if she could. Not that it would be fine. She hadn't known it would be fine. She still didn't know that everything would continue to be fine. The frontier didn't promise that, and she'd learned not to ask for promises the land couldn't keep. What she would tell that woman was simpler than fine. Keep going. Not because it gets easier, because the next thing is real, and the thing after that, and somewhere in the accumulation of real things is the life that was actually waiting for you, which is never the one you planned and is usually better than you'd have let yourself plan anyway, because planning is limited by what you already know, and you didn't know yet. She wouldn't have believed it in that hotel room. You couldn't believe something like that from inside the worst night of it. You could only know it from the other side, looking back at the closed doors and understanding finally that every single one of them had to close before the right one could open, and the right one didn't announce itself with a fanfare or a proposal or a dramatic gesture. It slipped itself under a door. In a folded note with uneven handwriting, from a man who was honest enough to say exactly what he had to offer and exactly what he didn't, and left the decision entirely to her. Silas glanced over at her. Something in her expression must have registered because he said, "Where are you?" "Here," she said, meaning it literally, meaning the wagon, the road, the golden evening, the ranch coming up below them, meaning the particular coordinates of this specific life. "Right here." He looked at her a moment longer, then back at the road, and the small thing at the corner of his mouth was not quite a smile and was better than one. She kept the reins. They went home. Rose looked up from the garden when the wagon came down the lane and raised a hand in greeting, an easy, natural gesture, a child's reflex toward the people who were hers. Caleb appeared in the barn doorway and leaned on the frame with his crossed arms, which now meant something different than it once had. Not resistance, just Caleb, just the particular shape of a boy who was his own person and had decided she was part of the landscape he lived in, which was the best version of acceptance she'd ever been offered. She pulled the wagon to a stop. She looked at the house, at the garden, at the two children who were both watching her with the ease of people who expected her to be there, which was not a small thing. The expectation of return, the assumption of presence. It had taken months to earn, and she intended to spend the rest of her time here justifying it. She climbed down from the wagon. "Beans are coming in," Rose said. "I can see that," Evelyn said. "Good." Caleb stepped on two plants. "I was checking the fence," Caleb said from the barn doorway, loudly. "You were not," Rose said without looking up. Silas came around the wagon. He stood beside Evelyn for a moment, looking at his children arguing about the bean plants, and she felt him beside her, the particular familiar weight of a person you've chosen and who has chosen you back, the specific gravity of a life shared in the unglamorous, ordinary, genuinely good sense of the word. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They stood there in the evening light and watched the children and let the day settle around them. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was the whole of what she'd come looking for without knowing she was looking for it. The woman three men had turned away in a public street had found, on the other side of every closed door, the only thing that had ever actually belonged to her. Not a rescue, not a redemption, not a second chance handed to her by someone else's grace. A life she had built herself, with her own hands, out of a bad situation, and a note with uneven handwriting and the simple, radical act of deciding to keep going when every reasonable argument said she should stop. She had kept going. This was where it had led. It was enough.